Come on, we're live. Go.
We are live. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone from Sao Paulo. It's 2 o'clock in Sao Paulo, or actually it's 8 o'clock in the evening here in Finland. Today we are going to discuss about mathematical learning difficulties, which is a global challenge everywhere. So, according to the UNESCO statistics, about 100 million children still haven't an access to school. And in addition, about 6 out of 10 children and adolescents who are at school do not master the basic mathematical skills after the 9 years of schooling. That makes in total about 700 million children in the world who struggle with learning mathematics. In this recent book published by Springer, The Mathematical Learning Difficulties from Lab to Classroom, we deal and talk about these questions with almost 100 researchers. And now here we continue this discussion with 4 top experts in the world, and I will shortly introduce these experts. First, we have Professor Brian Butterworth, who is an emeritus professor of cognitive neuropsychology at University College London. He works on the neuroscience and the genetics of mathematical abilities and disabilities in projects around the world, including Australia, Taiwan, and Singapore. Out of his extensive research work, his popular science book, The Mathematical Brain, was a bestseller all around the world. His test of mathematical learning disabilities, the Dyscalculia Screener, published 2003, changed the way how specific learning disabilities are identified. His latest book is Dyscalculia: From Science to Education. You can find more information about this book and other things about his work from mathematicalbrain.com. Caleb Everett is a professor and chair of anthropology in the University of Miami, with a secondary appointment as a professor of psychology. Caleb's research focuses on the ways, what are the profound linguistic differences and how they impact aspects of numerical cognition. Caleb has published extensively in journals across a variety of disciplines. His latest book, Numbers and the Making of Us, published by Harvard Press, was selected as one of the best science books in 2017. Teresina Nunes is emeritus professor from the Department of Education, University of Oxford. Her publications include close to 250 articles and book chapters, including 14 books. Her research covers the questions of development, learning, and education, especially in reading and numerical skills. One of her world-known books is Navina Des La Escola Zero, meaning in Life 10 at School 0. In English, this book has been published with the name Mathematics in the Streets and Schools by the Cambridge University Press. Among others, she has also been awarded the Hans Rosendahl Medal for innovative and influential research in mathematics education by the International Union of Mathematicians. Sarah Powell is an associate professor in the Department of Special Education at the University of Texas at Austin. Her work covers multiple aspects of special education and interventions on mathematical learning difficulties, focusing on remediation and intervention effectiveness. Currently, she's working on interventions on word problems, equation solving, science education, and algebra. She has also analyzed the special educational systems and especially the multi-level models of special education. So, welcome all. And now we will start our discussion. We have 4 topics to cover today. First, we talk about the origin of these difficulties. Second, we talk about cultural differences, the interplay between research and practice, and the questions of how to support these kids who struggle with mathematics, and what kind of education should we develop for the future generations. First, I will turn my attention to Brian Butterworth. Brian.
Hello.
Tell us, what do we know about mathematical learning difficulties? Why some children struggle with mathematics?
Well, there are lots of reasons for struggling with mathematics. We did a big prevalent study in Cuba some years ago, where we started with 11,500 kids. That is a universal sample for one district of Havana. And we found that about 9–10% of them were disfluent at arithmetic. But there was another group within that 9–10% who had a very special problem. And this problem we call dyscalculia, and it's different from just being bad at maths. We might want to compare this with dyslexia. Dyslexia isn't just being bad at reading. There's a specific deficit in dyslexia. It's usually phonological, sometimes visual, occasionally both. And it's not due to poor teaching. It's not due to the fact that no books are at home, or you've got illiterate parents, or there's no schools available. Those, of course, all make you bad at reading, but it's not the same as dyslexia. Dyslexia is congenital. It runs in families. Something like there's a 30% genetic effect for reading. That's not just dyslexia. Specifically persistent to adulthood, and it's independent of intelligence. At home, when you've got illiterate parents, or there's no schools available, those, of course, all make. I'm getting howled around here. I can hear what I've said some time later. So, like dyslexia, dyscalculia is not just being bad at maths. It's specific to numbers and arithmetic. It's a very specific deficit in very basic number processing. So it's not due to poor teaching. It's not due to having no numerical activities at home, which we've found actually does affect how well you learn, but it's not that. It's not because there's no school for you to go to. Like dyslexia, it's congenital. There's also about a 30% genetic effect for that's specific to maths development. Like dyslexia, it persists into adulthood. And like dyslexia, it's independent of intelligence, though, of course, good maths is often considered a proxy or a symptom of high intelligence. And it's very bad for you. In fact, surprisingly, it's worse for you, at least in the United Kingdom, it's worse for you than dyslexia. So though the prevalences are similar, the amount that you earn in a lifetime is highly reduced if you're dyslexic. It's about £81,000 according to a survey about 10–12 years ago. With developmental dyscalculia, it can reduce lifetime earnings by more than that, by £114,000. It also affects education more than dyslexia does. Not only that, but it was discovered by accountants who were looking into this, that it costs the UK about £2.4 billion a year, so nearly $3 billion a year, for the lowest 6%, which includes most of the dyscalculics, because they earn less, so they have less to spend, they pay less taxes, they're also more susceptible to disease, both physical and psychological. And of course, some of this additional money it costs us goes to intervention. And maybe if there was more money spent on intervention, you wouldn't lose so much on the other things. We also now know that there are specific signs in the brain of dyscalculia. So we know that there's an arithmetical network in the brain which connects the what's called the intraparietal sulcus, which are two areas about here in the brain, with the left frontal lobe, at least in most people. And it turns out that dyscalculics have abnormal gray matter density in the left or in the right intraparietal sulcus. There's also possibly different connections between these areas in the parietal lobes, the intraparietal sulci, and the frontal lobes. Now, I said that the problem here is basic numerical processing. It's not all of mathematics. I know very, very severe dyscalculics are good at geometry. Indeed, I think I know some real mathematicians, well-known mathematicians, good at geometry but not very good at arithmetic, who may, we haven't tested them, be dyscalculic. So what do I mean by basic numerical processing? Well, essentially, I mean they're inefficient at processing the number of objects in a set. So when we look at a set of glasses on a table, we're pretty good at estimating the number of objects in the set of glasses on the table. Dyscalculics are not very good at this, and therefore they have a poor representation of the numerosity of sets. Now, since sets and numerosities are the basis of arithmetic, this of course creates a problem when you're learning arithmetic, because these representations have to support arithmetical operations. Technically, what you want are representations that, when you apply operations to them, give you representations of the same type. That is, these arithmetical operations are closed under number. So if you've got numbers going into it, you've got to have numbers coming out, briefly speaking. So it's actually very easy to identify dyscalculics and distinguish them from people just bad at maths. As Pekka said in the introduction, we developed a method for doing this called the dyscalculia screener. And the critical component of this is how efficiently somebody can name the number of dots in a display, up to about 9 dots. So it measures both the accuracy of your being able to do this and how long it takes you. And this method was used in probably the longest longitudinal study of arithmetical development, which we carried out in Melbourne, Australia, with Bob Reeve. And we showed that kids who in kindergarten were really inefficient at naming the number of dots were the ones who, each year up to the age of 11, which was when our study stopped, they were way behind their peers on age-appropriate arithmetic. So there are other ways of doing it. You can compare the number of dots in an array with a digit. So if you show 5 dots and you show the digit 6, and the person has to say, is that correct? Again, you measure accuracy in time. And this is the method that we use in the dyscalculia screener. That's also the method that was used in the Cuban prevalence study. Another method that people have used is by comparing two arrays of dots, where you have to say, are there more dots here or more dots there, or are there more blue dots or more yellow dots? That's another way of doing it. So it's pretty easy to do because it doesn't take very long and it's very reliable. Just a brief word on intervention. This might come up in discussion. You have to develop a method which progresses an individual learner from operations on sets of objects. So they can be, if you've got a teacher doing this, sets of concrete objects, manipulables, and you should go from that in a way that links the sets and operations on sets to digits or the names of numbers. So if you, if the child or the learner has to combine, say, a set of 3 objects with a set of 5 objects, he should say 3, 5, and then for the union of those 2 sets, say 8. Then you should go on to operations on digits alone. One of the problems, at least with education in England, is that learning with concrete materials, with manipulables, generally finishes at the end of year 1. And for some kids, it'd be really helpful for them to go on to use these materials again in years 2, 3, or however long they need them. And the way we've been working at the moment is to use virtual digital materials. That is, have digital games which start with operations on sets and which go on in the end to operations on digits alone. And where, unlike most, I mean, there are thousands and thousands of number games out there, if you look, unlike those, you don't have multiple choice questions. You actually have to construct answers, and then you can see how your answer compares with a target that you've been given, and you can see whether it's too big or too small, and learn that way and make adjustments that way. So that's briefly what we think dyscalculia is, and how to identify it, and at least in outline how to intervene to help kids with this particular problem.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian, for the introduction. Now I'll turn my question to Sarah. Sarah, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
You have done an extensive amount of intervention studies.
Mm-hmm.
And here Brian describes a very specific type of dyscalculia.
Yeah.
In your samples of kids who have mathematical learning disabilities, whom you work with, how many of those you think have these very fundamental problems in the parietal lobes and representing number sets, or are there other types of numerical difficulties that you also have?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So our intervention work occurs in the United States, and in the school system in the United States, and it's probably something that Brian was talking about in England, schools don't always do a really good job doing early screening for dyscalculia. Schools do a much better job of screening for dyslexia. And so if we were to go into schools and say, hey, we would like to provide intervention to all of your students that have dyscalculia, we wouldn't get that many students, especially in the early elementary grades. It doesn't always seem to be a really strong focus for schools in the United States, as much of a focus as we would like it to be. And so most of our intervention work focuses on a slightly broader set of students, which are students with math difficulty. So a few of these students, I would say probably about 10% of them do have official disability diagnoses. Sometimes it might be a specific learning disability in mathematics, but sometimes it might be, speech and language difficulty or behavior difficulty or something like that. But the rest of our sample are those students that just are not meeting grade level benchmarks. And so we are there to work with this larger set of students. But I would say we just ran a study recently with about 450 students with math difficulty. And I would say probably maybe 5 to 10% of those students really do have some, I would say, characteristics of dyscalculia. We don't really screen for that. There we're looking at more arithmetic difficulty and word problem difficulty. But it's a small subset of the students with math difficulty, yet there's a lot of students in the schools that do struggle with math without the disability diagnosis or the dyscalculia diagnosis.
Thank you. Teresina, you have also studied different kinds of populations who have a very large variation in their mathematical skills. What is your opinion about when we talk about kids with mathematical learning disabilities? how many percentage of those who struggle strongly with mathematics you could define in the same way as Brian here defined the dyscalculia?
Well, my work doesn't really focus on the difficulties that children have, but actually on the difficulties of mathematics itself. Mathematics is a very complex body of knowledge. You know, it has lots of different difficulties in the sense that people have to learn to think differently in order to have the scientific mathematical concepts. So all of us, and I can't say whether the children with dyscalculia that Brian was talking about, all of us form concepts in everyday life, which are very powerful, but they are what we call the spontaneous concepts. And in order to learn mathematics in school, we have to reshape our way of thinking to develop the scientific mathematical concepts. So if I can give just one example, it's very easy for most children to understand the idea that if you put something more into a set, more items, or if you put more sand into a box, that could be the idea of addition. Well, that's the spontaneous concept of addition. But in order to make progress in mathematics, and that's from an early age in school, in primary school, you need to reshape this concept. And you need to think about addition also as the inverse of subtraction. As it turns out, this is a big stumbling block because schools don't invest enough time in helping children change from the spontaneous concept to the scientific concept. So there have been studies, and large-scale studies in London. The first studies were in the late 70s, and the second set of studies that replicated this was around 2002. And these studies show that only about 60% of the 10 and 11-year-olds had been able to go from the spontaneous concept of addition to what we could call a scientific concept of addition, and understood addition also as the inverse of subtraction, and also subtraction as the inverse of addition. So what I really focus on is not individual differences, but the difficulties of mathematics for everybody, which all of us have to conquer in order to make progress in mathematics. So I'm not quite sure whether this relates very directly to Brian's definition of dyslexia, but it would really be very interesting to know a bit more about how the concepts of operations and relations between operations develop in this special group of children who have difficulties with numerosity.
You just raised a totally new possibility to study the questions of dyscalculia, but I think we lost Sarah from online. So Emmanuel, could you help her to come back? But now, Caleb, you have studied the different languages and the how the language shapes our representations of number. When you listen to Brian, and Brian spoke a lot about this, some sort of a universal model of non-cultural aspects of the dyscalculia. as a researcher of language and culture, from your perspective, how does it sound? Can we find a similar kind of representations of number from all the countries, all the cultures and languages?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the research points to some underlying commonalities that exist across the world's cultures, right? So we have, things like the approximate number sense that are evident in every population that's been tested, right? Or things like some basic one-to-one matching skills that seem to surface, at least for small quantities, for all populations that have been tested, even those that I've tested myself and that others have tested that have no number words in their language. Having said that, there's still this profound variation, even in terms of what we often think of as basic quantitative skills. There's still some profound variation there that we see when we look at the cross-cultural picture, and that's kind of what fascinates me. But one of the things that struck me as Brian was talking is it becomes interesting when you have these diagnosable things like dyscalculia, and we have small populations, say the populations that I've worked with or that others have worked with in Amazonia and elsewhere, where these things aren't really haven't been diagnosed, right? So it becomes an open-ended question. Within these populations, what kind of variation do we see, and do we have members of these populations that have the characteristics that would be diagnosed as such? We really don't know, and we have a tendency to look at these populations of smaller groups, of hunter-gatherer groups, and think of them as single data points. And that's one of the things I've tried to resist in my own work anyway, is that even within small populations of, say, 500 people in Amazonia, you still get this range of different behaviors and range of different performances on the quantitative tasks. What that means is it's very hard in principle to establish which factors are due to cultural variables, which are due to linguistic variables, say variation in numerical language, and which are due to different genetic predispositions that people might have. But I do think that in some cases where we get to a population where it's been tested relatively well and there's the entire representation of the population that's been tested has certain patterns associated with their numerical cognition, then we can be more confident that the patterns owe themselves to cultural and linguistic factors for those groups.
I don't know how much you, Brian, heard about what the Teresina and Caleb and others said.
He's muted.
I heard nothing, I'm afraid.
You heard nothing. Teresina raised a very interesting question here about the difference between the spontaneous representations of arithmetic and number system and how increasing something spontaneously produces this idea of basic addition things, but to reach the level of the mathematical representation requires education. And since you mentioned that there are many children who actually never reach the level of scientific representation of the mathematics and arithmetic. And so here, one of the questions is whether there might be a connection between this representation of number sets and the ability to develop this kind of a scientific representation of mathematical concepts, or whether they are something which are more connected to the education and more general cognitive skills.
Well, I mean, obviously, having a good notation, either a verbal notation or a symbolic notation, is a big help, as we all know. Having a bad one actually can handicap you. So that's why it's difficult to multiply using Roman numerals or Greek letters. So having a good notation is really helpful. But it starts by being able to map these if you like, innate representations onto whatever your culture provides to you for doing stuff in a more efficient and more sophisticated way. So no doubt, when you encounter encounter cultural tools that may have taken thousands of years to develop, it's going to be a big help. Don't disagree with that. And how well you're taught them, or how, I mean, the context in which you learn them is important. But we did a study recently where we looked at kids whose language contained no counting words, and we wondered whether they were able to carry out calculations without having counting words, without knowing anything about them. So these were kids in Australia who spoke languages like Walbiri or Anandaliagwa, which have no counting words. And it turns out that if you ask them in the right way, they can carry out simple calculations. Of course, they can't carry out complex calculations, because this would be, well, to be honest, we didn't really try. They were between the ages of 4 and 7. So we didn't do much with them on more complex calculations. But addition and subtraction, they did, as well as kids in Melbourne, the same age, though they did them rather differently. So there's a kind of an innate system that you have to map onto the cultural tools that your culture provides to you.
Okay. Let's continue from this culture issues. Caleb, you have studied extensively different kinds of cultures and how the numerical systems work, and maybe you could give us a short introduction on that topic and tell about the research you have conducted with the questions of different numerical languages and numerical cultures.
Sure. So from my perspective, if we're into understanding numerical cognition of humans, then that means trying to get a sense of the actual diversity of human populations and how they interact with numerical concepts. As Brian just mentioned, this includes indigenous groups in Australia and places like Amazonia and other parts of the world that have very diverse number systems, or in the case of a couple of groups in Amazonia, seem to have no number systems at all. And then what does this mean for how people acquire numerical concepts? And what does it elucidate vis-a-vis the native quantitative concepts that we bring to the table as a species? It's very tricky, as I mentioned before, to do this research, in the sense that we have to be careful, I think, of saying what the causal factors are necessarily, right? So if we find differences in, say, Amazonia, how much of it is due to cultural factors? How much of it is due to linguistic factors? How much of it is due to something else? But I think maybe the overarching theme of some of the research that's come out of anthropology and linguistics is that number systems vary dramatically. There are these commonalities that we see across the world's number systems, but they vary in really pronounced ways, in ways that I think are surprising to some people. They vary. So first off, they vary in terms of their range. This is something that Brian was just mentioning. So you have groups in Australia that maybe don't seem to have precise number words, although in Australia, it's a 1-2 many. It's a common system. And there's actually been some interesting work on Australian languages showing that the number 5 seems to serve as this cognitive accelerant, where once cultures get a number 5, they sort of grow a number system pretty rapidly. And this happens across the world's cultures, it seems. So the range, whether languages have number words or not, or how many number words they have, that's one thing we see cross-culturally. The kinds of bases that exist, right? So most cultures around the world, most languages have base 5 or base 10 or base 20 systems because of the number of fingers and toes we have. But we see variation, right? So there are base 6 systems. There are some other exotic bases out there. And I think it remains a bit of an open-ended question, how much this variation in bases impacts how people acquire certain numerical concepts. We also see variation in terms of grammatical number, right? So getting back to the case of Australia, so Aboriginal groups are interesting because to me anyway, because while Australia is this known case where there are many groups that have fairly modest number systems, grammatical number is really pervasive in Australia. So you get things like singular and plural and dual marking, which means that to acquire that language, you have to consistently, from an early age, learn to make distinctions when you're talking of one versus two versus many. In contrast, you have cases in Amazonia, Piraha being a famous case, Munduruku being another, where in the case of Piraha, for instance, there is no grammatical number in the language, so there's no distinction between singular and plural and dual at all. There are no precise number words at all. So these are very extreme cases in Amazonia of totally numberless groups. So you have variation in grammatical number, variation in the kinds of number bases there are, variation in the range of the size of the number systems. And then lastly, something that I've been exploring recently, and I have a paper in press on this, is variation in usage. So on some level, it's common sense that cultures vary in terms of how much they use numbers, right? So a hunter-gatherer group in Amazonia is not going to have need for numbers as much as an industrialized society. But what I find interesting is that even when it comes to these native quantities that we seem to be able to handle with some degree, even in the absence of numbers, things like 1 and 2 and 3, even these number words for these concepts vary tremendously in how much they're used. So in this paper that I mentioned, I look at data from about 5,000 languages, and there's indirect evidence from those languages that there are these strong pressures in terms of how much even words like 1 and 2 get used. All of this suggests that kids, as they're acquiring numbers, unsurprisingly maybe, they face very different social contexts in terms of the amount of numbers that they're exposed to and the kinds of numbers that they're exposed to, whether bases, whether grammatical number, as we see in Australia, whether no number at all, as we see in a few cases in Amazonia. And it's interesting to explore, to me, what these linguistic differences across the world's roughly 7,000 populations, what these things do to how we acquire numerical concepts. And I think we're just now starting to get some of that picture, and that there's a lot more research to be done, and how that impinges on how we teach kids math in quote unquote developed societies is something that I think we're also just maybe getting a handle on. But hopefully there are some lessons in the cross-cultural data and in the cross-linguistic data with the diversity of human populations that can help inform some of those discussions as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. Of course, as a person who hasn't been in these kind of places, just a side question to an expert: how dangerous it is to go to the jungles to study these? Have you had any extreme situations there in your studies?
Yeah.
Have you met a huge ants? What it is to do a research like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think all field workers have stories of confronting disease and confronting. But I think in general, in my case, I mean, full disclosure, I was raised sometime in the jungle. My parents were missionaries, and so I had a natural interest in it, and I had a natural comfort, I think, in going back to the jungle. I will say that once I became married and had a child, my comfort level dropped a lot. So if you take your child to the jungle and they get sick, then you start to question your decisions, right? So that happened once or twice, and I haven't taken my child back. But for me, it's something I'm quite comfortable with. I don't think about it too much, but heat and bugs.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Teresa, you have studied children with different kinds of the same language culture, but different kinds of experiences. In your world famous book about the street children, how different are their language and representations of number from those who are of the same age and at the same age but at school? How different is the culture and the language of these kids in their numerical world?
Yeah, well, I would say that it's not a linguistic difference that we are looking at when we look at children who learn mathematics outside school, but it's a different form of sign. And in this case, I'm not talking about brain representation, I'm talking about cultural representations. The oral numbers are very different from the written numbers. And what we have found in the studies of children who learn a lot of their mathematical skills outside school is that they have a very well developed skill of using oral representations and a much more limited skill in using written representations. Now, these representations are actually quite different because when you operate with oral systems, you actually keep the quantity in mind. So if you're doing a sum like 200 minus 130, you refer to the hundreds and the tens as you subtract. So you say 200 minus 100. You don't say 2 minus 1, as we would do in written representations. And that makes a huge difference, that the symbols in oral arithmetic remain connected to the quantity that they represent, and that children are not just operating on symbols disconnected from the quantities that they represent, as we do with written algorithms. So I would say that's a different kind of cultural influence on how children learn and understand mathematics, even though they all speak the same language and they all write the number system in the same way. The oral calculation practice is a different practice from the written calculation practice.
Thank you. Brian, can you hear us, Brian? You have been working recently a lot in places like Singapore, Taiwan, and we all know that these countries are top performers in international comparison studies in mathematics education and learning. How much do you think that this kind of results are connected to the structure of the language, what is in Asian languages, about the clarity of the 10-base system in spoken language and how it matches with the Arabic number system? Or what other things might explain that early on we can see these differences in acquiring the basic number system?
Dr. Brian, you're muted. Dr. Brian.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. There's a lot to be said about the Singapore education system. I mean, the first thing is they take mathematics education very seriously. Education is conducted in English, even though the home languages can be very different. I mean, Malay, Chinese, and so on and so on, various Indian languages. Whether this makes a difference, I don't know. But one of the things that distinguishes them, at least from my point of view, is that they take dyscalculia very seriously. So although they're top of the league, mostly for maths education, there are still 8 to 10% of kids who need learning support in mathematics. And that's why they came to Diana Laurillard and myself to see if we had a way of helping them with helping these kids who are really failing to make adequate progress. I have to say that their existing system didn't seem to me to be very good. So even in England, kids who are doing really badly often get one-to-one help from specially trained teachers. They don't get that in Singapore. They get group lessons, and with group lessons with kids who are not very good, a lot of kids just don't engage with them. So what we've done there is we've developed some digital games that kids can play, which seem to be helping them. So we've got some preliminary results from, I don't know, about 10 schools and about 180 kids. And it does look as though these games actually help when you see if the kids are making progress in curriculum-based tests. So I can't make any generalized comments about why Singapore kids are doing so well, but I can say that they take it very seriously. For example, I have never been asked by my Department for Education to come and talk to them about dyscalculia, but I have been to the Singapore Department, Ministry for Education, on many occasions to talk to them about dyscalculia. And that gives you one reason why they could be doing very well. And the other reason is that their ministry has as many civil servants in it as ours does, even though their population is a tenth of ours. So I think taking it seriously is one of the explanations. Not language, because they're taught in English, and often English is a second language for some of these kids. So that's not the story there. Taiwan, I don't know about the educational system as much in Taiwan. I do brain imaging there, which is different.
Sarah, you work in Austin, Texas, and now listening to Brian, that in Singapore actually the language of education is English. In Texas, you have an extensive amount of immigrant kids from Latin America. And are you surprised that in Singapore they reached the top of PISA with using a second language to learn, if you compare the experiences from Texas?
Yeah, so in Texas, and I think in a lot of other states in the United States, there are different arrangements for students who don't speak English as their first language. So here in our area, in our research projects, so we will have some students, and many of them are native Spanish speakers, but not some of them speak other languages other than Spanish. But because there are so many Spanish speakers, some of our students are in classrooms where English is only spoken. Some of our students are in classes where English is spoken, and then they may receive some support in Spanish. And then we work in a number of classrooms that are what we call bilingual classrooms, where students are receiving most of their instruction during the day in Spanish, and then learning English as they go. And so for some of the students that participate in our intervention projects, they may be receiving their math instruction in English, whereas other students are receiving their mathematics instruction in Spanish. And right now we are still providing our instruction in English because we're working on word problem solving, and it's taught through English. But I know there are some other research teams that are developing analogous programs in English and Spanish to meet the needs of a pretty substantial number of students in the United States who are not only newer to the schooling system, but also learning the English language as well as learning all of the content area instruction that they are expected to learn. So I think it's interesting that in Singapore, all students are learning in basically what we would consider is their second or their non-primary language. They're learning mathematics and that, where in the United States, we are trying to provide, I think, more language support to some of these students so that then they can move forward after they have a strong understanding of the English language.
This is an interesting question, and Caleb, I'll ask you again. Actually, the most of the children in the world actually live in more or less multilingual cultures and even multilingual families. So it's more common that the children live in cultures which have interaction between languages is very frequent, and children learn these number concepts and others in multiple languages. Well, just your speculation that what kind of effects it might have the representation if you learn them in different languages. Does it have a positive, negative effects? Does it affect on the representations you develop?
Dr. Caleb, you're muted again.
It helps if you can hear me. So you see populations that that this is true of, right? Multilingual, and you have many populations, which what I find interesting is you have populations where the second language is the national language, and the first language is a language that doesn't have a very robust number system, or doesn't have a number system, say, beyond 20. So for instance, one of the groups that I've done the most work with in Amazonia is a group called the Caritiana. And you see a tremendous amount of variation and familiarity with mathematical concepts because of this bilingualism. So a number of the younger people are quite fluent in Portuguese and know the Portuguese number system, the decimal system, quite well. And then a number of the older people are not, and they're familiar with the traditional Caritiana system, which is base 20 or a vigesimal system. But it really, constructing numbers beyond 20 is somewhat unwieldy, I would say, at least from an outsider's perspective. And so how that impacts basic mathematical concepts is that, unsurprisingly, I guess, the younger kids that are familiar with Portuguese numbers are better at math and get turned to for when what we would think of maybe as basic math problems, when they need resolution. Oftentimes the older people will turn to the younger kids. And this isn't just a matter of education, so education is part of it, but it's also just a matter of with a number system that has a higher range. So the traditional Tupian languages, this language family in Amazonia, they have numbers, but they tend to not have numbers beyond 100, and many of them don't have numbers beyond 20. And the evidence for numbers beyond 10 is pretty limited. So obviously that's going to impact how you do, again, what I would say most of us think of as basic mathematical tasks. In contrast, if you speak a language like Portuguese or English, and you're familiar with a high range of number words, this is going to help you in a lot of ways. And one thing that we see, at least from the perspective of anthropology, that we find interesting is that a lot of these traditional number systems are dying. So the extent to which, because of these factors, right? So as people are put into contact with hegemonic outside groups, and as they're forced into trade, they need to rely on number systems from languages like Portuguese and English. And with time, their number system falls out of favor, to the extent that there have been a couple of populations where it's been claimed they had no native numbers. But then when, in the case of one group, I did some follow-up work, and it was clear that they did have a native number system, but it's just fallen out of use completely because everyone has turned to Portuguese numbers, which are more useful and have a higher range. And this is something that's happening, obviously, not just in Amazonia, but is happening worldwide in a lot of different places where these small endangered languages are being forced into contact with the languages of larger populations that have more robust number systems.
Interesting. let's move forward to to Brian just mentioned that he has been invited to the ministry in Singapore, but never in UK. But I think one of the problems in UK is that they're so busy with Brexit that they have no time for research.
Well,
But Teresina, you have been long time working on reading and mathematics education development. You have done a lot of research on that, and you have published an extensive amount of books about the development of education system and how to work on those things. So in your opinion, we know that the politicians should listen to what Brian says, but also the teachers should be more aware of the research, or should they? This is a constant question, that how much the research actually gives materials and methods to education. What does the research offer to educational practice? Teresa.
Yes, well, I think in this dialogue between education and research, it is education that poses a lot of challenges for research, because in the research domain, we have been able to deal with relatively simple aspects of mathematics. And of course, in education, the teacher can't tell the student, well, there is no research on how to teach this, so go home and come back when we have the research on how to teach. So teachers have the great challenge to have to teach things for which they have no evidence. Now, it is the challenge from education for researchers that is helping people who are interested not in children's difficulties, but in the difficulties of mathematics for everybody. I think this challenge has been very inspiring for many people. If I could have that slide number 3 to help me make this point visually, but if the slide doesn't work, I'm going to just say what is on the slide. I don't know if we have Emmanuel and Lucas there. No, so I'll just pose the problem in words. So if you can just imagine that you have 2 chocolates and 3 children are going to share these chocolates. So we could take the first chocolate, divide it into 3 and give 1/3 to each child. Then we'd take the second chocolate and divide it into 3 and give 1/3 to each child. So if I ask people, okay, how much chocolate would each child get? Everybody thinks it's obvious, each child's going to get 2/3. Now I'll take another example of situations in which we use fractions. So imagine a jar with orange juice that was made with 1/3 concentrate. And then we have a second jar with orange juice that was made with 1/3 concentrate. And we take the orange juice from these 2 jars and put it together in a bigger jar. So what's the concentration of orange juice in the bigger jar? Well, it's not 2/3, it's 1/3. And that is just an example of why we need to look at numbers when we are teaching children mathematics, as having 2 kinds of meaning, because the arithmetic for these 2 examples is different because the 2 kinds of quantities are different. Now, I can use the technical words here. You know, one kind of quantity is called, to know what arithmetic we have to do to solve a problem, we have to use what is called quantitative reasoning. And quantitative reasoning relies on two kinds of number meaning. So that's a very complicated idea, but it does come from the complexities of mathematics. One meaning is referential, so we have to know what the numbers refer to. And the other meaning is what we call an analytical meaning. It's part of how the number system is defined. So in order for children to actually be good at mathematics, they need to be able to master both kinds of meanings. And one of the challenges that research now poses to education, after having digested these ideas about two kinds of number meanings, is that what we can call the traditional model of teaching has been that we teach arithmetic, which involves just looking at the analytical number of meaning and saying, you know, how the numbers relate to each other, to teach that first, and then teach children to apply arithmetic to quantities. But in fact, what the research shows is that we have to do it the opposite way. We have to work with quantities and relations between quantities and help children build number concepts from these relations, so that when they understand extensive quantities, they understand that numbers work in a particular way. And when they think about intensive quantities, they understand that the numbers there work in a different way. This might seem that it's something that only secondary school students can understand, but it's not true. You need to work with these concepts from primary school so that children, and this is part of what I mentioned earlier on, there are spontaneous concepts and scientific concepts. The spontaneous concepts, when it comes to numbers, they just relate to natural numbers and maybe to whole numbers. Maybe they include negative numbers. But the scientific concepts then involve other kinds of numbers, like rational numbers. But they can be built even from first grade, from age 6, we can be starting to help children realize that there are different kinds of quantities, and for that reason we need different kinds of number. So in the same way that we can't just teach number without thinking about the quantities that the numbers represent, we can't just teach arithmetic without thinking about the relations between quantities. So what research shows, and this is not actually a very new finding, is that children can solve problems about quantities before they solve plain arithmetic problems. I mean, Martin Hughes in the early 80s showed that 2 and 3-year-olds could answer what was 2 bricks plus 1 brick before they could answer what's 2 plus 1. So that's a very big challenge now from research to education, because as the teachers tell me when I talk to this research about them, is we're turning everything around. What research is doing is say, start from applications and treat numbers as an abstraction from applications, and not start from the abstractions, which are numbers, and then try to apply the abstractions.
Thank you. Sarah, you have done a lot of intervention studies, and when you listen to Teresina's ideas, this kind of concrete, semi-abstract, abstract models are more and more common in the intervention research. But do you see that this research is changing the learning materials and school books at school? Is this already familiar to teachers working in the practice, or is it still that it's more like researchers trying to push it there?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of Teresina's points about how we can develop, I'll just use a little bit different language there, but the conceptual understanding perhaps before the procedural understanding. And we do see variability in the United States in how schools teach math. And so there are some schools, and usually it's guided by the standards and the materials that the schools use, where they are a little bit more conceptually heavy. So they are introducing these concepts and getting students to explore these concepts as they, in many times, simultaneously also introduce the procedures that go along with helping support the understanding of the concepts and vice versa. Many times when it comes to teaching students with dyscalculia or students with math difficulty, we do observe that many people kind of go more to the procedural end of things. And I think that first, that's a little bit easier to develop than conceptual understanding. And so if we want to get like a lot of bang for our buck, like let's help our students with their arithmetic skill, let's help the students with the word problem skill, and that can, move the dial forward for students. But then without that conceptual understanding like, well, what does this word problem mean? Or what does it mean to multiply numbers? That's going to only have short-term gains for students. So I know a lot of researchers that are working in the intervention realm, I am only one of them, are really trying to push forward that the interventions that we provide for students that have math learning difficulty aren't just procedural driven interventions, but are really emphasizing the concepts of math. So what does it mean to regroup? What does it mean to have zero pairs in algebra? What does it mean to recognize the structure of a word problem? That type of instruction is harder to provide, but it's then going to see longer term gains for students, so that, then they carry this knowledge with them to the next school year and are able to apply it, or what we call transfer, to more novel type mathematics problems.
Thank you. Caleb, I'm sure that many teachers find the research you do very interesting, but do you think they can connect your research somehow to their work? What would be your message in that there? How your basic research about the representations and cultural things in number representation, how that connects to the everyday work of the teachers at school?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's debatable how much applicability there is, right, when you're taking finds from these very diverse cultures. But I would say that maybe the one thread that runs through my research and through the research of a lot of people is that the amount of linguistic exposure to basic number words and to different kinds of linguistic instantiations of number concepts, that this matters, right? So obviously we have these native capacities as a species that we bring to the table, but it still matters how much we're exposed to things early on, right? So we see this even in, for instance, in a couple of the Amazonian populations that I mentioned earlier. There are differences across villages from what we can tell, right? So even in terms of some of the basic experimental tasks that we've done, there are differences in what we think of as very basic quantitative reasoning skills, like hidden matching tasks, one-to-one correspondence for larger sets. And some of these differences correspond to the different villages, correspond to how much exposure they've had to number words, right? So that's hard to establish definitively, but it's certainly consistent with the picture that we see. right? So for instance, amongst one of the groups in one of the villages, there was someone there who taught them number words and taught them number words past 10. And in that village, we saw this sort of aberrant pattern where those people, even including some of the adults, were better at some of the one-to-one matching tasks. So we can't establish definitively that's because of the linguistic exposure that they had, but that's certainly consistent with what we see, right? With what the data are saying. And as I mentioned earlier, this is something that I think is a bit of an untapped idea, which is that the amount of usage of number words across the world's languages varies substantially from what we can tell, right? So we tend to think of what numbers does a language have, and then we just sort of group languages that way and say, okay, this language has a base 10 system, or it has number words for 5, 6, and 7, and this language doesn't. But there's this other variation that's sort of underneath and less obvious, which is how much are the number words actually getting used in the culture. And there the data are pointing to this kind of variation that we haven't really paid much attention to before. And I would admit that the data are pretty poor at present. So hopefully as we get more data, we can better inform these kinds of questions. But if there is applicability of my work and the work of other anthropologists, cognitive anthropologists doing this kind of work, I would say that the theme that they point to is that amount of exposure to these to words and other quantitative concepts instantiated linguistically matters. So like even though we all have these native capacities for numerical cognition, that how those capacities get refined matters in accordance with to the amount of exposure you have to the linguistic instantiation of those concepts.
Thank you. Brian, we know that Boris Johnson is not going to invite you to Downing Street 10, but he also follows YouTube. So now you have a good opportunity to give him a message. Many of the teachers are interested in the question of how the brains do work. What is the mechanisms of the number representations? And more we know about the genetics, but how that kind of information about the neuroscience and genetics, how that actually has an effect on what should be done in education. What is the message of neuroscience to education? So, or educational policies also.
Well, I mean, as Teresina was saying, of course, education poses challenges to the science as well. And so it's going to be a two-way street. But one of the things I think is important is that we make maximum use of the connectivity that things like Google Hangout and other digital media offer. So I don't think these are going to be effective ways of teaching kids how to do arithmetic. That's a separate issue, and I'll return to that in a moment. But I think it's a very good medium for providing continual professional development to teachers. So, for example, my colleague Diana Lorillard has had several of these MOOCs, massive open online courses, and one that's currently running is for teachers of refugee kids in the Lebanon. But she's also had a UNESCO one. And the idea here is that you teach teachers the best ways of teaching whatever it is you want them to teach. And they could also teach other teachers. So you get a kind of trickle-down effect of best practice, conceptual ideas, both in education and in the subject domain. So I think that's very important. The other thing that the other way which you can exploit these digital media is in terms of the appropriate kinds of games to teach them, for example, about intensive quantities and extensive quantities, how they differ and how to manipulate them. So this is not always obvious to teachers. They might know it, what shall I say, without thinking about it or without just knowing it, but without being able to explain it. And so something like a MOOC would be helpful to teach teachers of primary school kids how best to explain intensive and extensive quantities to their children. So I think there's a whole area here that can be exploited, and I don't think anybody's doing much of that. Certainly not our Department for Education. Sorry to bang on about this. I mean, I've gone to ministries of education around the world, but never here. Boris Johnson is not going to make any difference to this. I mean, he probably will. If he becomes prime minister, he won't last long. I mean, that's for sure. I don't know. I don't know what the issue is about. Well, let me just say, I managed to get 2 parliamentary questions asked about dyscalculia. And the reason for this is because if you go to our Department for Education website and type in dyscalculia, all you get is that dyscalculics are forbidden to drive heavy goods vehicles. Why? No idea. But that's the only thing it says about dyscalculics, which is amazing. So we had a couple of parliamentary questions asked by my member of parliament, and we got very unhelpful answers back from the department. So there's also a problem of political recognition, at least in this country, of these very severe problems that kids have. And also, but on the other hand, a lot of teachers are, they are beginning to recognize dyscalculia as a problem and are very keen to take professional development courses to find out more about it. And, I go to schools here and tell them about it. I'm going to one next week, tell them about it, try to persuade them to use some of the materials that we've developed. And, hope that eventually kids who suffer from, throughout their school life, because they can't do what everybody else can do in their class, one can reduce that. As for the genetics, you mentioned genetics. Well, terribly complicated business. We don't know what genes are involved in mathematical development. We know that they are involved. We don't know what they are. We know they account for quite a lot of the variance. And we're currently working on a project to identify the genes responsible for dyscalculia in fish. And that's progressing quite well because we know we've sequenced the genome for these fish, zebrafish. And we can create mutant lines to test whether particular genes help or hinder this fish in doing numerical tasks. So you might think it's a bit crazy, but we've got a lot of money to do it. And we think maybe something useful will come out of this. And if we can identify the genes, then one way in which this is going to help education is that we can tell teachers, parents, and learners very early on which ones are likely to have trouble later on with arithmetic, and one can take the appropriate steps to help them before they start to suffer too much.
Thank you. And let's move to the last subtopic of today. Sarah, Brian just mentioned that we need to try to teach the recognize and identify those at risk very early on. Mm-hmm. But because we know that the dyscalculia is not something which just disappears through age, but it is a very consistent and persistent problem. And, mm-hmm. and we know that there in the top performing countries in the world, there's more and more special educational services offered. It was interesting to hear that how little in the educational policy system these questions are discussed, but there's more and more research on special educational systems and methods and interventions, and but they are non-existent in most of the parts of the world. And now the question turns to research that what do we really know about how special education should be organized? Do we have any understanding and research and knowledge about the good or very potential methods that could be applied all around the world?
Yeah. So we do know some things, just like a lot of these questions around dyscalculia. We don't have all the answers, but in some of our intervention work here in the United States, we have learned about strong support systems that can be put in place at the school level or district level or state level that then really help provide preventative instruction to students. So that they don't, as Brian was saying, so that these students don't continue to struggle as they proceed through their life. So things that are really important are that schools need to have a framework for identifying students that have math difficulty or dyscalculia, and then being able to do something with those students. And a lot of schools in the US have very good support systems in reading. So if you enter grade 1 or grade 2 and you are not meeting certain expectations related to letter sounds or word recognition, the school usually jumps in and does something immediately because they're very concerned about students' reading skill. And really, I charge schools that they need to have the identical process set up in mathematics. So early on, when we identify these students with dyscalculia, or we see that students are not meeting grade level benchmarks, okay, what do we do, right? I think Brian's comment is that it's kind of like maybe we just pass them through, and if we don't do anything, that is really an unequitable practice to allow students to proceed through grade levels without providing the support that they need in mathematics. And so when we think about that framework, it first requires screening. So who are the students that need supplemental support? And then once we identify those students, that framework requires really three overarching things. One is very good instruction. Second is assessment to understand whether that instruction is viable and enough for the student. And third is like a decision-making process to understand, do we need more of this? Do we need less of this? Has this student, overcome a lot of their challenges? And so we need to put that framework in place, and it's a school-wide framework. It's not a single teacher that can do this. It doesn't occur at a single grade level because, as Brian was saying, dyscalculia can be identified very early on. Yet we will see some students, we're doing a middle school study right now, where we have what we call students that have kind of a late emerging math difficulty. So they're starting to experience difficulty in math when it comes to learning algebra or more complex, geometric concepts in a way that we haven't seen before. And so it's not just something that has to be put in like the primary grades, but we need to make sure that this structure exists when students are 10 and 12 years old. And we need to make sure the structure exists when students are 16 and 17 years old. There are likely a lot of students that are, about to graduate that still need this support. But it requires an entire school to come on board and put together this framework. It requires a lot of understanding about what does good instruction look like for students that have learning difficulties. And I would say that's one of the things that we know a lot about how to provide instruction to learning difficulties, but then there's, as kind of Terezino was saying, there's a lack of transfer of research to practice because teachers aren't always aware of these really good practices. So when we think about instructional supports, we need to be talking about really good direct or explicit instruction. As Brian alluded to earlier, we need to be bringing in lots of concrete and virtual manipulatives so that students see the process of math. We need to, and this is kind of what Caleb was talking about earlier, we need to focus on the language of math. I read an article a few years ago, it talked about every student is a language learner in mathematics. And so we need to be helping students access the oral language of math, the written language of math, so that they can communicate and understand mathematics. And then we also, the other two things that we know a lot about is we need to help students build strong arithmetic skill, because a foundation in arithmetic is going to make everything that in mathematics that much easier. And we also need to help students be problem solvers in math, because that's how math translates to how you use math as an adult. It's almost always through problem solving scenarios. So we need to give students real life examples of how we use our mathematics and then how they can apply their mathematics in real life settings. And so a lot of the work that we're doing here in the United States is focused on that. And so I think we have a pretty strong understanding of how to teach students that have math difficulty, but it's utilizing that within the framework that combines the instruction, the assessment, and the decision making. That's where a lot of the breakdown occurs, because schools don't always have that structural support in place.
This might be a question to all of you. What do you think? Do we need in every school or district or system? Do we need teachers who would be specialized in numerical questions? Would that be the solution, or should we have teachers who are specialized in special education, or do we need dyscalculia teachers? Would that be the solution? Which way to go? What kind of specialization these teachers need to have that we can increase the quality of the education of children with mathematical learning difficulties? Teresina, what do you think?
This is a really interesting question, because the government in England, I can't say it was in the UK, it was in England, made a decision probably about 10 years ago to have in every school a mathematics specialist teacher. And this was promoted by Professor Celia Hoyles, who was at the time a special advisor to the government on mathematics. And there is a structure created in an institution that's called the National Center for Excellence in Teaching Mathematics. So this national center provides ongoing professional development for teachers. And this is a mechanism that I have seen working very well in England. I have worked with the National Center on many different occasions, and I can truly say that the teachers who have become part of this network are very different teachers from many other teachers who haven't become part of it, because these teachers know quite a lot about research. But unfortunately, they don't spend their time in the classroom. They spend a lot of their time providing professional development to other teachers. When they do spend time in the classroom, I think they make a huge difference. But I can't say that on the basis of research. What I can say is that when we work with them, we can see how very quickly they are able to understand ideas that challenge what they have been doing previously, and to explore these ideas in new ways. So in some of our research with the school system, we have been able to show that working with these teachers, and when this is a randomized controlled trial, they changed only 12 of the lessons that they gave to children in grade 2. And that gave these children a 3 months increase in mathematical skills in comparison to the control schools that hadn't participated in this change. So we found that working with these teachers who had become mathematics specialist teachers made a very big difference for children in schools. I mean, just imagine changing only 12 lessons. It wasn't additional time in maths. It was just changing what they did in 12 of their lessons in one school year. So the structure is there, but of course it depends on the support of the government and the continuation of the program, because this program, it was created by a previous government, a Labour government, and when the Conservatives were elected, they discontinued the mathematics specialist teacher education. So I have contact with the ones that were educated before this discontinuation, and I don't know whether new people are coming into this system. But it has been very interesting for me to be able to see how these mathematics specialist teachers make a difference.
Yeah. Caleb, do you think that in these, especially in those indigenous cultures, which are just starting to integrate to the educational systems of the mainstream culture and mainstream language, do you think that you need some sort of a specific understanding about the numerical world, numerical languages, and how people acquire those, so that the educational systems can develop?
Yeah, I would think it would certainly be beneficial, right? And I think for the educational systems that are in place, I'll take the nation that I'm most familiar with, Brazil, but some of the same principles apply elsewhere. The way that the teaching happens for the indigenous kids is they're essentially and understandably forced to learn Portuguese and then just taught as other Brazilian kids are taught. But it would be helpful, I think, if in at least some of these cases, people had some awareness of what the number systems were like of the actual languages that they were teaching these where they're teaching math to. Because sometimes the translation of those concepts is a bit tricky, right? So if you have a different kind of base system and then you're learning a decimal system, that can be a challenging thing. Now, obviously, it happens all the time and kids do it, but I do think that a higher degree of familiarity with the indigenous system, rather than just seeing these people as math illiterate or as people who just need to learn the Western way, having some understanding of the indigenous systems would benefit those kids as they're learning Portuguese numbers or English numbers or whatever number system you're talking about worldwide.
Okay, Sarah, what do you think that in these, for example, in this US system, which is the most important thing to focus right now in the development? Do you need more dyscalculia expert teachers there, or do you need to focus at the systemic level and developing that, so that there are resources and better ways of identifying the problems? What would be your message to the development exactly right now? What is the most?
Can I choose both of those? I would choose both, but I would like to, I'm really interested in this effort in England that Teresina was talking about, but then really disappointed that it's not being continued based on different governmental priorities. But I would really love to see more schools be able to support, have math specialists or dyscalculia specialists who are really able to differentiate the instruction for students and provide that support as needed. Because if we think of the structure does need to change, but that can take years, if not decades, to really get different structures in place. But we have, hundreds of thousands of students in the United States right now who do struggle with mathematics, and the outcomes for these students in terms of college and career are not that promising if we don't do something now. And so I think, training teachers in their pre-service programs and then working with in-service teachers to provide people that do become specialists and really know how to provide support across the grade level continuum in terms of developing conceptual knowledge in math and procedural knowledge in math. That would really help this current generation of students move forward and perhaps achieve stronger outcomes than they might if they wouldn't receive that support.
Brian, 2
Yeah,
minutes.
can I
2 minutes.
just ask? Can I just
do
ask?
we-
Can I ask?
Yeah. Do we
Can I ask
need-
on Sarah something? I mean, I agree with everything that Sarah said.
Okay.
To what extent are these structural interventions that you talked about, to what extent do they depend on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act? The fact that these kinds of problems, dyscalculia, are actually embodied in law. Is that
Yeah.
a really important issue?
So it's variable, you know, but some schools do have more funding to provide targeted support to students that do have an official disability diagnosis. But as I kind of said earlier, there are a lot of students that don't receive that disability diagnosis because of our, you know, lack of attention to math difficulty from early on. And so we need to figure out how we could fund teachers of those students so that those students don't continue to move from grade level to grade level and continue to fall further and further behind.
But I mean, does the idea, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, does that actually provide money for teachers for kids with these special needs?
So IDEA typically provides money to the school district based on the number of kids in the district that have a diagnosed disability. And then it is the school district's responsibility to figure out how that money will be spent above and beyond like normal student expenditures for students without disabilities. Some school districts do use for like reading specialists, not as many for math specialists, but this is where you might see like behavioral therapy for students with autism and that type of thing. The school district spends that IDEA money on those supports, but it varies from school district to school district.
Okay. Can I just ask Pekka a question? What do they do in Finland about dyscalculia?
What do we do with, okay. The interesting thing here is that actually we don't care about the diagnosis. So we don't do official diagnostics here. But already our law says that whatever the learning need the child has, the teachers need to react immediately. And we do have, basically in every school, we have dedicated special teachers who have expertise in, especially in reading difficulties, but more and more they have knowledge and understanding about the math disabilities too. We don't have dyscalculia teachers, but we have special teachers. And the legislation actually gives rather strong backup to the teachers to try to intervene as early as possible. Of course, the resources is always a problem because kids have all kinds of problems in learning, and not only in mathematics, and all kinds of problems need attention, and that's why the question of what kind of educational system would be most effective to support the teachers and to react as early as possible. We are working on that, and that is a continuous question of development. And what is positive in the Finnish system is that teachers are eager to learn. And I think there will be many teachers in Finland who will also listen to this discussion about dyscalculia and math learning disabilities, and they are taking your lessons with them. and now we have already exceeded our planned time, but there's one thing we haven't discussed at all, and that's why I would like for you all to send one message. And that is that most of those who will listen to this presentation, they are also parents, and many of them are parents with children who struggle with mathematics. So, what are those two sentences you would give now to those parents? Teresina, you can start.
Well, I hadn't thought about talking to parents, but I think the main message I would send is that just interact with your child and ask your child questions that will involve reasoning. Don't worry as much about teaching the children number facts as they now currently do in England. Get them to reason about quantities in everyday life.
Okay, Caleb, what would you tell to the parents?
I mean, one simple message is simply expose them to number words early and often.
Okay, Sarah.
My advice is whenever you think your child has math difficulty, start to pursue avenues to help them out. Don't just let it go, but go to the school, go to the experts, and also, as Teresina was saying, do stuff in the home to really try to foster an enjoyment and love of math.
Brian.
If your child is having trouble, serious trouble with arithmetic anyway, doesn't mean he or she is stupid. It means they've got a very specific difficulty, and that, as Sarah said, you should seek specialist help for that particular difficulty, because that might get it sorted out, and it will relieve you of a lot of worry. It will relieve your teachers of a lot of worry, because they're failing to teach the child effectively, and it will, of course, help the learner understand what his or her problem is.
Okay, thank you. And I would add there one message to the parents, which is, let's say, it's an advertisement. To the end of the discussion, if you're a parent whose child struggles with mathematics, or you know someone who struggles with mathematics, go and tell the teachers that there is a lot of research done in this area, and this research will give you good ideas to the teachers and to the parents, but especially to the teachers, about how to improve and develop the education and educational systems. And just to mention at the end, there are new books from us. There are new book from Brian, very interesting book from Caleb, many interesting book from Teresina, and it's very interesting research conducted by Sarah and others. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Teresina, Brian, Caleb, and Sarah, for this 1 hour and 45 minutes. One system of ways of telling the time. Here in Finland, it's late night already. In Sao Paulo, where Emmanuel and Lux are broadcasting this, it's only afternoon. It's time to go to the beach for you. We will go to the late evening bars to digest the understanding you have given to us. Thank you very much for this discussion. The discussion will continue.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice.